Good morning, everybody. I sense that kind of slight expectant hush that means that you're expecting things to start. So let me welcome you very much to this session on the Data Values Project. My name's Claire Melamed, and I'm the CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, which is the convener of the Data Values Project, which we are a network. We bring together over 300 partners to discuss and to act on many of the topics that we've been talking about over the last few days here at the forum. We focus very much on working with our government partners, civil society and private sector, both to put into practice many of the things that we've been talking about better data, using data for decision making, and creating very practical partnerships to solve some of the big challenges that countries are facing around, obviously, health, the COVID pandemic, also climate, and helping countries to achieve their priorities around the Sustainable Development Goals. But we're also very aware, as a partnership which brings together organisations which are concerned with the production and the analysis and critically the use of data, that we're operating in an environment where, as we all begin to recognise the importance of data as part of the infrastructure for delivering change in people's lives, we're also in an environment where data itself is a subject of huge controversy, and many of the normative and the governance challenges around how data is produced, how data is analysed, and how data is used are very live topics of conversation, both politically, among civil society, and among the companies who are trying to navigate this space effectively. And, you know, one only has to look at the media around Facebook over the last few days to understand how absolutely critical it is that we have this public discussion and bring together the different actors. This is something, you know, we've been talking quite a lot over the last few days operationally about how many of the challenges that we're facing in very practical terms cannot be overcome without partnership. The same applies to the development of the normative and governance standards. If this is a world in which we're all playing, everybody has to be part of solving these big new public policy and social policy challenges that we face. Sometimes I think the challenge is as basic as we almost don't really know how to think about data, let alone what to do about it. And when you look at I have a bit of a sort of private hobby of collecting the analogies, the things that data is compared to. And we have obviously oil, very popular, land, water. Also, interestingly, in one that I actually didn't really understand, even having read it, bacon. So, and I think this sort of plethora of analogies just illustrates how confused many of us are in sort of how to think about data and what to do about it. And that is very much where the Data Values Project comes in. The Global Partnership is, I firmly believe, quite a unique network in the space, in that it brings together and was created specifically to bring together some of the very different communities that are active in the space. And in a moment, I will introduce our fantastic panel who themselves bring together and embody that kind of cross-institutional dialogue that the partnership is founded on. But we bring together government statisticians and the whole institutional architecture of statistics together with the private sector and the whole of the sort of industry conversations that are going on around data, and of course with the critical input of civil society and the huge concerns are in civil society around privacy, around the ownership of data, and around how value and active action is extracted from data for whose benefit and to what end. So given that we have this very unique network, we felt it was really important that we brought this network to bear and had a conversation about regulation, about normative frameworks that possibly could only really be had within the partnership, have it with the sort of unique possibility of bringing together these very different worlds. And that's where the Data Values Project comes in. It's a very open conversation, still in, I think it's fair to say, relatively early stages. Be interested to hear what the panel think. And as we discuss, as we frame the challenges and try to come up with common solutions, we really have we have sort of two aims in mind. First of all is to understand where the agreement is. What is the agreement on common norms, common approaches that can be achieved between these very different types of stakeholders? And if you can achieve agreement within this project between the government representatives, private sector, civil society, that I think is good grounds for thinking that these are the policy agendas and the ideas that will gain traction out there as we expose them to the light of policy making processes in the world. But also, and perhaps just as importantly and equally interestingly, is to understand what are the remaining disagreements. What are the things on which there are fundamental differences of opinion? And what are the sources of those disagreements? That if we can't achieve 100% consensus, and I very much doubt that we will, what can we at least hope to understand each other a little bit more and understand why, and what are the incentive frameworks, what are the institutional imperatives, the fundamental differences of approach that give rise to some of the remaining intractable disagreements. And at least that then would provide a better basis for overcoming that mutual understanding, will we hope provide a better basis for overcoming where we cannot reach consensus. So those are the objectives of the Data Values Project, which we'll hear a little bit more about over the next hour or so. We're working towards what we hope will be an actual sort of practical agenda for advocacy. And that's very important. This is a fascinating discussion, and I will look forward to having it with you over the next hour, but it is also a practical proposition. We want to come out with some ideas that we hope will begin to gain traction in the real world as actual substantive basis for policy and for overcoming some of these, as we've been hearing and will continue to hear over the forum, very difficult challenges as we all come to grips with this, still actually quite new world of data and technology, and of course the changes that we constantly confront every day. So before I introduce the panel and begin the discussion, one of the things that we put a premium on in the partnership generally and in the Data Values Project particularly is really bringing in a breadth of voices and including within the conversation some of the voices that perhaps one doesn't always hear within the kind of more formal and official channels. And we have done this in the Data Values Project and taking advantage of the new virtual world that we're living in through a series of fireside chats, virtually fireside, of course, and bringing in different voices. So I'm going to play you very briefly a few clips from those fireside chats. So the first voice you're going to hear is from Gwen Phillips, who is a citizen of the Tunaja Nation, a champion of the British Columbia First Nations Data Governance Initiative in Canada. And she works with the First Nations Information Governance Centre. And she was talking to our friend and colleague Tom Orrell, who unfortunately is not here today, but I'm hoping perhaps is listening online. We can't see who is online, but I'm sure we have many friends also in the virtual audience, and a very warm welcome to you. So if we can please play the first clip and then followed by the second clip. Thank you very much.
And so we will no longer allow the federal government to report on how sick and ugly and dysfunctional Indigenous people are, because we're not. Sure, we're suffering, but that's the only data that they collect. They don't collect data that shows the strengths we have, the strengths we've had. They don't collect data that actually acknowledges even the assets we have in our communities.
Thank you.
And so for us, our interest is to collect data that helps us to determine how strong and healthy we are as the Tunaja peoples. What the federal government is working on is to close the gap between how well we are and Canadians. And for us, that's measuring assimilation. Why would we do that? And so self-determination is deciding who you are, who you were, who you are, and who you want to be. And data goes right along with that.
Thank you so much. I think that's it for me. That's really an incredibly powerful reminder that while we talk about inclusion and absolutely quite rightly insist on inclusion as one of the characteristics of the data of the good data systems that we're looking for, we need to think very hard about the terms of that inclusion, that it's not as simple as simply saying, count everybody in the way that we think they should be counted, but very much about considering where people's own perspectives are coming from. So let me just, sorry, I interrupted the order there, giving the technicians a hard time this morning. But let's now turn to the second clip from Caroline Tetti, who is the Africa Director of Recipient Advocacy at Give Directly, which is a non-governmental organisation, for those that don't know it, which is really trying to kind of challenge some of the traditional approaches to aid, to donor relationships, and to simply give money to people, to give unconditional cash transfers to people who live in extreme poverty. And she was talking to our also friend and colleague, Elizabeth Ombulabi, who, again, unfortunately is not here, but I very much hope is listening. Hi, Liz, if you are. So if we can have the second clip, thank you.
And so for us, our interest is to collect data that helps us to determine how strong and healthy we are as the Tanakha peoples. What the federal government is working on is to close the...
We who live in spaces of decision making, whether it is in the donor space or in the government space or wherever it is, we make assumptions that we know what people actually need. And therefore, we take money and decide what projects community need. At Give Directly, we have said that in addition to what other organizations are doing, we want to put power in the hands of people living in poverty. And we want to give them an opportunity to make the decisions about their lives. That is a first step towards equity.
Thank you very much indeed. So I think, again, we talk often, and again, rightly, it's something I firmly believe in, about data as an instrument of power, and that people having access to data can give them more power over their lives. But that puts the onus very much on those institutions that have power, that have, in this case, resources, to use to first of all, collect the data which enables us to understand what people want to do with that power. And secondly, which actually leads to action in terms of transfer of resources, decision making, and so on. So as you will see, much to discuss. I'm very keen to dig into these specific issues around equity, inclusion, representation. There may be other things that we come to in the course of the discussion, also more broadly around data governance, privacy, and so on, that are obviously very much related. But let me introduce the panel. We'll have a bit of conversation among the panel, and then very much planning, if we can keep to time, that we will also have an opportunity for a bit of discussion with all of you, and to hear perspectives and questions as well. So I'm sure that this panel and this panel at this event needs almost no introduction, but the conventions must be observed. So so let me just welcome Charles Kimpolo, who is, you've already seen on the plenary earlier on in the week, who is the director of the industry initiative at the African Institute of Mathematical Sciences. Sitting next to Charles is Gabenga Sasan, who is the CEO of the Paradigm Initiative. Sitting next to Gabenga is Francesca Perucci, the Assistant Director of the UN Statistics Division, and in a sense our host for the week. Well deserved. Sitting next to Francesca is Claudia Wells, who is the Director of Data Use at Development Initiatives. And sitting next to Claudia is Juan Daniel Oviedo, who is the Director General of the Administrative Department of Statistics of Colombia. So yes, let's applaud the panel. Yeah. And you. Thank you very much. So let me just start with a few questions to provoke discussion, and then, but please also feel free to discuss among yourselves. Juan Daniel, I think, we heard very powerfully from Gwen about the sort of how the terms of inclusion really matter. That simply to talk about inclusion, but not to understand the way in which people want their lives to be reflected in data, is absolutely critical. Now, I know in Colombia, you've really put a premium on an inclusive data system, and have done a huge amount of work to turn that ambition into reality. So I'm just interested for you, how what Gwen said in those first clips resonated, and how you're tackling this issue of the terms of inclusion in data through your work in Colombia.
Thank you, Claire. And again, we are very happy to be here in this conversation. And I believe that this is something which is essential when we are thinking about inclusivity in statistical production, because we cannot make assumptions. And at the same time, as statisticians, we should identify which are the differences. So we are not looking forward to closing gaps. We are bridging gaps because we want to know better what's happening at the other side of a self-determined or a self-recognized ethnicity, for example, that we have in Colombia. And this is something that has been tremendously complex. You might imagine that was me before being the Director General. Look at me right now. It's tremendously complex because you have to understand another way of thinking and assessing how the real world happens. So sometimes in Colombia, we have a very, very important differential approach in the National Statistics Office, but it is difficult to communicate, which is the objective of this differential approach, because we have a very important part of the population which is self-recognized as indigenous people, and we have people from African descent, and we have a Rome population in Colombia, and they have a perspective. First of all, sometimes they misunderstand what we are trying to do, because, you know, as Gwen was saying, they are closing the gap. They want us to be equal, and we don't want to be the same. We just want to show what's happening from the socioeconomic context that they are facing and how public policy could set some differential approaches of public policy in order to increase their well-being. But in order to be very honest with you, sometimes they just want to be enumerated. Yeah, they tell us, just give us the number. Just give us the number, because this is one of our key issues to be visible in our society. We are X%, 10%, 4% of the population, and this is our power. And this is something that has been very, very important in the differential approach that, for example, in Colombia, we started with the Inclusive Data Charter experience from the gender perspective. And we started to understand that it's important to introduce the differential approach along the value chain of statistical production. We need to assess ourselves, or to ask ourselves, which is the objective of this kind of assessment or appraisals of information that we are doing. And this has been something that changed the way we approach a population, for example, indigenous population or people from African descent. And this has started to make a change, because we need to develop conversations under which we have to let them visible in the essence of the questions that we are trying to address, for example, with a survey or with a census that we performed in 2018. So I believe that the main lesson of what Gwen was saying is that we should understand that we provide services to this population, and we need to understand which are the user needs, and we cannot make assumptions. This is something that is very essential in this task, and I believe that Colombia could be a good, very good experience in order to share the mistakes and the success that we have performed during the last year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan Daniel. And just sort of zooming from the country experience to the international statistical community experience, just want to bring Francesca here in here. I mean, the whole sort of architecture and the categories and the whole sort of process around what data we collect and how it's collected is very much governed by the sort of methodological traditions, and the kind of the international standards have been driven very much by sort of methodological concerns around the rigorous nature of the data and the accuracy and so on. I mean, do you think that this statistical architecture can sort of cope with accommodating this sort of Gwen's concerns around the need for nuance, for consultation, for having a statistical system which is driven perhaps sort of as much by politics and sort of anthropology as by statistical methodology?
Yeah. First of all, thank you, and thanks for having me in the panel, and it's a great pleasure and happy to be also in the Data Value Project. It's been a fascinating journey so far. Yes, I think what we've seen, especially after the adoption of the 2030 Agenda, was an increased attention, obviously, for many obvious reasons, including fulfilling the principle of the no one left behind, and increasing attention to how we disaggregate data. But I think that's where we've done it to some extent the wrong way, because it's not really about disaggregating what we normally collect, but it's about rethinking what we measure. And I think in doing that, you really have to look at the data value chain even before you get to the collection. So it's a sort of an extended data value chain. It's a step before you start collecting data, and that is about deciding what you measure. And it's very much what Juan Daniel was saying. It's not closing the gap. It's understanding what these other groups come from and what their needs are. And if you go back in time, when we started talking about gender statistics, it was very much the same type of approach, right? We were looking at sex disaggregated data 30 years ago or even longer. And then we realized we were not really looking at what women needed to be measured because of their policy concerns, because of their priorities, to be empowered. So we started looking at what really the aspects that we were completely overlooking. And it was not about disaggregating by sex, because we did not have the measures that we wanted to disaggregate. We were completely missing out on what needed to be measured. And that's what Gwen was saying, right? The concept of assimilation, of closing the gap. That's not what is needed, and that's what we see in the 2030 Agenda. It's not about taking what you have and just creating the categories, right? It's about engaging with all stakeholders, engaging with all the groups, and understanding what needs to be in our framework. But as you say, our frameworks are traditionally sort of, we all go by international agreements and understanding. We have frameworks for everything. We have the SNA. We have very well-established conceptual and measurement frameworks that were established decades ago. And it's hard to change that. It's very hard we heard Julio yesterday, right? All the challenges that a National Statistical Office faces when trying to incorporate new data sources and new methods that allow you to reach out and to count everybody and to include all those new concepts and to conceptualize it, all those new needs. So it's difficult, and it's a huge challenge. And it's not just a question of resources. People say, oh, it's hard to disaggregate because you need more money. No, it's a question of rethinking the whole data value chain and rethinking how you conceptualize what you need to measure. I'll stop here because I can speak forever about this.
Thank you. And with two mentions of the data value chain, let me just recognize Shaida in the audience, who actually, I think, originally came up with the concept of the data value chain, which has now entered the language to the extent that we forget who created it. But I credit for that idea goes to Shaida. So, I mean, I think both of you have been talking very much from the perspective of governments who are investing in official statistics and who are collecting data in order to make people's lives better, in order to improve service delivery. And obviously, that is the norm in most countries. And we hope that absolutely data can play a part in making that the norm in more countries. But that isn't always the case. And as we know, for many people, they are not fighting to be included in data. They are fighting to be invisible in data because they fear what a government might do if they become invisible. So Gbenga, I mean, thinking, in answer to Gwen's comments, again, we're very much from the perspective of a community that wants to be included on its own terms. Yeah. But I know that there are many other communities who do not feel that way. So what do we do about inclusion and the need to have information which reflects the whole of society when, for often very valid reasons, people don't want to be included in that data.
And they have many reasons not to be. Let me start with a true story. So yesterday evening, probably someone else in this room experienced the same thing. My wife and I were talking, and I needed to get access to a picture that I'd sent to her. And then I went to my phone, and then I went to Facebook, and it didn't open. So I turned off my phone, and then turned it on again. And I tried to call her back on WhatsApp, and it didn't work. And I thought to myself, so I'm from Nigeria, and the government already turned off access to Twitter in Nigeria. And I thought to myself, I think I'm in Switzerland. And I doubt that the government of Nigeria told them I'm here and for them to turn off access. But what you experienced yesterday is what currently is being experienced by Nigerians as far as Twitter is concerned. They won't get access to Twitter except they go to go on VPNs. And that speaks to what for many people is a deliberate data access disruption, right? Where certain governments deliberately, we've heard from governments like Iran or Algeria or Ethiopia where they turn off access to data because they claim students are writing exams and they don't want them to cheat. Okay.
They don't want to play or to be distracted.
Right. I mean, if you're the teacher, then I have questions about your methods. And there are other countries like Uganda who during elections say things like, we don't want you to share the results in advance. And so we turn off access to data. But guess what? That then gets everyone else interested. What don't they want us to know? And I think that would have been enough on its own. But then we got into this whole era, right? The new normal, COVID, the whole data life cycle. When you are going to get on the flight, you have to show and prove that you're human and fit enough not to be a danger to everyone else on the plane. Then you get to the conference. I got my vaccination in Nigeria, so I then had to take that data, put it into a new database, to comply with the EU standards. And you have all of this, information. So in 2020, we saw a new normal where people needed to cooperate with government to share data so that we can all end the pandemic, right? But people don't trust the same government. So what do? I don't trust you with my data, but I need to give you my data so that we can both solve the problems that we have. And so we now get into this, dog chasing its own tail. And I think that this should speak to many of the reasons why people do what they do in terms of data and the distrust in government. Yeah. Of course, distrust in government isn't just because of data. There are many other reasons. But I think there are two critical things I want to mention this morning. One is in terms of data purpose limitation, because we have a scenario where there's too much collection of unnecessary data. I'll give you an example. So in Nigeria, I'm supposed to connect my bank verification number, which in itself is a different story entirely. For a while, I didn't have access to my bank account because I had to register and give up my biometric information, which is already in the passport that I used to open the bank account. So all agencies of government, like 7 different agencies of government, are collecting data and biometric information, not sharing with each other. And then again, I have to get another one, my BVN, and then get a national ID number and connect my phone. There's a chance that on October 31, my phone will stop working. So Aidan and my other friends, you may not be able to reach me. But the challenge with this is that we collect so much data that we don't even need. Mm-hmm. And so when that data then gets breached, so if what you collected was only what you needed and there was a data breach, then you have less of a problem. It is a problem, of course. But when you collect data you don't even need, and then when there's a breach, there is now a big challenge. And I think this is one thing that governments need to take a critical look at. Why are we collecting this data? What are we using it for? And when do we need to give up on this data? Because we're now in this era where data collection is a new norm. Every government has an app to confirm if you've been in contact with anyone and things like that, asking you questions, even irrelevant questions. And I think, and I know, one other thing is in terms of the intent of the data. I mean, we can talk about that, forever. But I believe that as various stakeholders, we need to have this conversation and say that the purpose of the data needs to be exact. There are many other issues to concern, but I think one thing I want to really, happen this morning is on data purpose limitation. We're in this new normal, and I worry that some of the, relaxed ideas of, people saying, well, you can get my data because we need to solve this problem, can then become what many governments will hold on to and continue to do perpetually, even when WHO says the pandemic is over. And that is a big worry. And that, of course, explains why, many people in many of the countries where we work do not really trust government and will not, give their data, even at a time when we all need to have this shared trust and use data to combat a major crisis.
Thank you. That's so interesting. I mean, we tend to think about the sort of public communication and advocacy around data as being clear about what governments will do with your data to make your life better. But perhaps it's equally important to think about what governments won't do with your data and the kind of circumstances in which they won't be using it or will give it up. Thank you so much. That's really interesting. So I think that's a really good segue now into thinking about some of the comments that Caroline made that were specifically really about the sort of power imbalance between different actors, and particularly around, within obviously the kind of, the institutional architecture around international development, and the huge imbalance in power between some of these communities that we're talking about and some of these obviously very large and very well-resourced agencies that are collecting that data in order to allocate resources at an enormous scale. So just turning to Claudia, obviously Development Initiatives has also made data inclusion and equity a really critical part of your work and the work that you do around the world. So from that perspective, how do you think we can start to sort of come to terms with this huge imbalance in power within the data ecosystem? And what should we, particularly those with power, do differently to try to rebalance that?
Thank you, Claire, and thank you for inviting me on this fantastic panel. And it's lovely to see you all here. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think actually the wording of your question gives it a little bit away. We've got to come to terms with some things. So before I start, I want to let you know that I am a card-carrying member of the Data for Good community. I passionately believe that data can have a positive impact on people's lives, as I hope do you all here in the room and online and on the panel. We know that data can really have an impact, but it's time we started to be a bit more honest with ourselves. And what I haven't seen recently is that reflection and that honesty about where we've got things wrong. And it's so important. And I was reflecting because we had two great plenaries yesterday. The first one on statistical capacity building. And the question was, were we getting it right? And from my point of view, we should have all been stood up screaming, no, we're not. And being really honest, asking ourselves some really hard questions and then listening to some of those really painful truths. Because we're not getting it right. And what I heard from that panel was a wonderful lady from the Government Statistics Office of Samoa, who said, we are being left behind because we are not allowed to do our own data analysis. I have to say, I was ashamed to be part of the data community when I heard that. And I think we need to feel that emotion as a community so that we are spurred into action, because it is not right that our processes are extractive. That is the absolute first thing. And we can't accept that. And we should be angry with ourselves that the processes have got so extractive that actually we're talking about building capacity of others when we're taking away the opportunity for them to build that capacity themselves. And I think that is a really, really, really important thing for us all to realise. And then the second panel on Leave No One Behind. We talk a lot, we already have, about inclusivity and engagement with communities. But what I heard was that our processes are prescriptive. We go in and we tell people what issues they should care about. Inclusivity is not me offering someone a seat at the table. Inclusivity is me getting up, finding your table and asking if I can have a seat there, and then listening patiently to what you care about. We talk a lot about data demand, data literacy, and I get a little bit frustrated with those conversations as well, actually, because I don't think that numbers are baffling. I think that people do care about data and statistics when it's attached to an issue that they care about. And that is how we get demand. And how do we know? And the problem is we're being too prescriptive. We're telling people what they should care about. We should be sitting and listening and understanding what the issues are. So we need to stop being extractive. We need to stop being prescriptive. And really live those values. And I think if we're honest, and if we're honest about where we get things wrong, we're very good about championing where we get things right, talking about our wonderful innovations, which are fantastic, and we must learn from each other. But we must also collectively learn from our mistakes and be very honest about those. We can have integrity then, and then we will build that trust that my colleagues were talking about. And those are our core values. And it's going to be a difficult, difficult journey, and we need to support each other on that, because it's going to be hard, it's going to take time, and giving up power will be difficult. And so we need to support each other in that.
Thank you, Claudia. I mean, I've heard you and colleagues sort of get close to this, but I think I've never heard you say it in quite such sort of stark terms. I think that's a really fantastic kind of example of the, of the openness of this conversation, the trust that has been built up over time in this community, that we can, we can say things like this to each other, and I think it's really important. So all credit to you, Development Initiatives, for being part of that conversation. I think this is really important, and I think, as you were saying, the sort of huge imbalances of power and the kind of communication and trust. This brings me to Charles and thinking about the role of the private sector here. Often when we talk about governments, there is an element, obviously, in most countries of democratic control over governments. They have an interest in listening to people in particular ways. Data can be a driver of accountability between governments and their people. But the relationship with the private sector is quite different. We see huge potential in those partnerships, and a real sense, I think, always in the data conversation, and here is no difference, of the huge benefits and excitement of working with the private sector on many of the innovations and so on, but also some of the biggest challenges in this normative conversation and some of the issues that Caroline was talking about, imbalances of power, also comes from people's concerns about the private sector, their control over data, their use of data, coming back to the Facebook conversation over the last few days. So I think the kind of imbalance of power there is huge. And often sort of quite hidden. So just interested, Charles, to hear, if we're thinking, as following Caroline's clip, of imbalances of power, of how to sort of rebalance and make sure that everyone is getting a fair deal, how can we make sure that governments get a fair deal in those public-private partnerships that we've been talking about, and also thinking about the protection of citizens within that?
Thank you very much. I also wanted to thank you for inviting me and to be part of this conversation. Claudia, thank you very much for that definition of inclusion. I think I'm taking away. I thought that inclusion was getting people on the table. You're saying that we need to go to the table of those invisible people. That's quite a very important lesson. Thanks. So yes, I think for the data value project, the key word for me is value. And when it comes to citizen privacy, I think there's value to ensure that we protect the privacy. Sebenga was just complaining about collecting too much data. That's one problem in our assessment. We don't know what they're actually doing with that data. We don't know which platform they're going to actually put our data. So for me, the relationship between government and private sector should be what we have been learning here, based on trusted partnership. I will come back to say private sector should be on the table. Government has a difficult work if you really understand how they navigate, especially in the part of the world we're coming from. So I'm from Congo, Brazzaville. I'm living in Rwanda. It's a lot of things, right? You're moving from agriculture-based economy to digital economy. Let's not think that it's easy to do that. You need to regulate. Even in the regulation, do you think that the government, every government have a capacity to understand how to regulate these things? We talk about Facebook and Google problem. In the part of the world that we are, I don't think that is even a serious regulation in that sense. So for me, the first thing is for government to have capacity to understand when you talk about digital economy, what kind of transaction of data that the private sector is doing with the citizen. So that's number one. Again, when it comes to regulation, I'm not looking at the technical side of it. It can also be the legal part of it. But it's actually to come to the table with the private sector, have honest conversation when you look at each other in the eye to say, my citizen privacy is something that I cannot compromise. While I agree that you are doing business, you're creating jobs, you're developing services, you might be addressing financial inclusion, but there are red lines that I don't want to cross. Let's develop policy that is, for me, it's important to have buy-in policy. So who will write the policy? Who develop policy? I think policymakers should just understand that in the process of developing policy, they need to talk to the private sector in a manner that they get the buy-in. They provide the framework to get feedback, because don't lock yourself in a room where you develop policy and you bring it to people who say, I don't know what you're talking about. I think that's what happened in a lot of parts of the world, because yes, that's one thing. I've seen countries like Rwanda, they have a data revolution policy. I'm part of a steering committee there. I will tell you it was not pleasant a meeting where people shout at each other, where the private sector is there, civil society is there, the academia are there. But it's important for us to agree to disagree in those rooms where sometimes when you get there, you get hit. But at the end of the day, we say, what's the way forward? Mm-hmm. Because citizen privacy is, there's no customer in the bank that say, okay, play with my data and put it everywhere, right? I think that's like their principle, their rule, their roles and responsibility that we need to clarify in that. But for me, it's important to do it together, because sometimes private sector are investing a lot of infrastructure, data collection is clean, and the government say, come and share. Yes, I believe we need to share data, but it should be done in a manner that makes sense. Sense from the business sector, sense for the private sector, sense for civil society, because I believe a civil society on the table is going to be like, I'm not government, I'm not the private sector, I'm a civil society, I'm representing the community to say the way you're doing it is not actually right. So my contribution is to have everyone on the table, for the government to assess whether they have existing policy. If they do, let's leverage that as a resource. Let's review it, because digital economy might mean different things. If we don't have one thing, let's develop those policies. Developing policies should be a journey. It should be a process that is inclusive in a way that you shouldn't exclude people. You should understand what you're talking about. That's why we need to build capacity of policymakers to really understand that writing a policy of regulating data that you don't even have a database or a data center is not an easy job. You need to do it. And we need to use also best practices to see how it's happening in other parts of the world, so that even if we want to customize in the local context, we're still actually having benchmark, right? We're not doing it like the hard way, where the private sector thinks that I'm leaving, right? So yes, that's for me, trusted relationship, be on the table, speak honestly, even when we should agree to disagree, but define a red line that you shouldn't cross. And for me, citizen privacy is a red line. You cannot compromise that. That's what I can say to advance the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Charles. No, and thank you to all of you. Really interesting. Now, there are many people in the room who are also part of our GPSDD technical advisory group, which leads and drives the data values project. So I'm really keen to hear from all of you. We're moving into the 15 minutes that we now have allocated for discussion and questions. We also, in the spirit of inclusivity, have some really great questions from our online audience. So what I'm proposing to do is to just raise two of the issues that have been raised online. Perhaps invite you panel just for super quick, maybe one or two of you to come back super quick. And then I'm very keen to turn over to the audience to really make this an open discussion. You can address specific questions to the panel if you like, but also if you have short contributions to make of agreement, very short contributions you want to make of agreement or disagreement or raising other issues, please let's make this part of the discussion. So there is, as you would expect, lots of really good questions online. There's a couple that I sort of particularly want to raise because they speak to different aspects of the same thing. So one is really just about actually getting practical with this whole question of data trust and data use. How do we actually, what are some of the kind of examples of how we actually assure people that the data we want to collect from them will be put into use? So it'd be interesting to hear from you, Juan Daniel, on kind of in very concrete terms, what's the strategy, what's the communication strategy in Colombia to actually communicate directly about that data back to people? And then we have a question here also from Tom Orrell, who we mentioned earlier, who was the person who spoke to Gwen in that first clip. And he has a great question, which I have to confess is quite a challenge to all of us that I hadn't. I'm going to read it out in full. He says, a lot of the conversation in the past few years in the data for development communities has focused on open data publication as a way of improving data use, government transparency, and good governance. But it feels like it's become quite a mundane and technocratic term over the years. In light of the Pandora Papers, for those who have not had access to Facebook or WhatsApp or anything over the last few days, there's been a large leak of financial disclosure papers, which has made life very, very uncomfortable for many of the leaders of many of your own countries, actually, and certainly mine. Where was I? And thinking about in light of the Pandora Papers and thinking about all the issues that are live at this World Data Forum, from financing for data to improving trust and good governance, is it not time, and this is especially for you, Claudia, that we refound our activist edge in the data for development community and pushed for open data that actually reveals corruption and improves trust? And this bit especially for you, Francesca. With this in mind, should the forum not welcome the publication of the Pandora Papers as a positive example of data disclosure in its outcome document?
No pressure.
Thank you, Tom. Tom, we love you. Yeah. Hi, Tom.
So let me just, we don't want to steal time from the audience, but let me just invite, I'm going to be super strict about time. If any of you have got a 30-second response to either of those, then let me invite that, and then we'll come back to the audience.
Okay, I think that communication is something very important in this interdisciplinary dialogue, because with a very, very sound communication framework on identifying purposes and accepting mistakes, I believe that this was something very important in the case of Colombia, because it is very traditional that the statistical offices do not commit mistakes, but this is something very complex, and we have to understand that sometimes we have misbeliefs, we have misperceptions about what we are doing, and we have to be very honest in order to rebuild trust with the communities. And I believe that this is something that should allow us to understand that interdisciplinary dialogues in statistical productions are very important. Mm-hmm. So we need to understand that we are the means of developing some other conversations, and the data collection is not the goal itself. We are just providing some tools in order to allow some other communications and discussions between those communities and the government, which is something very important.
Thank you. Would anybody like to comment on the Pandora Papers?
I can comment on activism. So I think my short answer is, should we be activists? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, we should be activists. It's very difficult to go through a process of evolution if you're going to transfer power. We need to go through a revolution. And we've always been talking about a data revolution, but for me, it's not necessarily a revolution in the sources that we use. It's a revolution in our approach, the partnerships that we make and the behaviors and our values. And that's where it's important. We need to step up into our roles as duty bearers and be accountable to the rights holders. So the answer is yes.
Yeah, I'm inclined slightly to want to speak up for the sort of values also of sort of slower burn technocratic change here, but that's not my usual stance. Francesca and then Charles, then I'm going back to...
Yeah, I don't know if I want to comment on the Pandora Papers, but one point I want to make is that, and as somehow along the lines of what Claudia said, the data revolution, I think we still need to, in order for the data to be trusted, we still need the official statistical community to be responsible for it and to really go back into a good data governance system. And we need to rethink, and we need to rethink what we measure, and we need to rethink what I said in the beginning. We need to rethink Sheda's data value chain from the very beginning on what we measure. We need to ensure data rights. We need to ensure that we incorporate the new data sources the right way, because they're not necessarily about giving you more granularity or inclusion. We need to rethink all that, but we need to build trust within the existing system, official statistical system, because that's the one that has guaranteed data protection, confidentiality, and data rights and independence from all these other possible threats, right?
Yes.
So that's, I think,
Thank you.
to my dear friends in the national statistical systems.
Okay, I'm going to invite Charles and Benga very super quick, and then I'm going to go to the audience. We'll have a round of contributions from the audience, and then I'll come back very finally to you for final words. But just...
Yes, but for me, just a balance between how do you promote activists within the framework of the data revolution being led by government. I think we need to ensure that in some countries they don't work together. Activists wanted to really say stories that governments sometimes are uncomfortable to actually listen, right? So I believe that data revolution should be driven by government, and understand that, but it's all about being on that table. What's the role of activists? What framework do they have really to say what they should say? Because if we don't really draw that line, it's very complicated. You say, you activists, I want to promote you, but at the same time, you need really to go to this system for you to say what you want to say. For me, that's still a question.
So activism is like encryption, right? Unfortunately, right now, we look at activists and think, these are the guys who are causing trouble. Meanwhile, we should all be activists.
Yeah, exactly.
The same thing with encryption. We used to think encryption was something that some people needed because they had things to hide. But guess what? We all need encryption because it's your business what you do with your information. So I think ideally we should all be activists. We need activist governments who would ask the right questions. We need activist companies who would challenge governments that say, shut it down. We need activist investors who would say, what are you doing with all this data? And not, outsource activism to the guys in the civil society. We should all be activists, really.
Thank you. Okay, I have seen now lots of people who want to ask questions. Okay, we're going to go slightly over time by your leave. If people have engagements, engagements on the dot of 10, we will understand if you need to creep out slowly, but I think we probably can afford to go a few minutes over.
Thank you, Sheda Bedi. The great panel. Just a very quick point. I have many points, but I'll just make one. I've selected my point. And the point is that we should be, as part of what we're trying to increase the value, to be able to measure it, measure effectiveness, and not be shy about, we are low in openness, or we are low on governance, we are low on data stewardship. So as part of the Data Value Project, in fact, we are embarking on this, of finding out what are the different ways to measure effectiveness of development data products. And I think that would be really opening up a lot of conversations for around the topics that we talk about, activism. So activism shouldn't be just blah, blah, blah. It should be really grounded on measures and grounded on principles. Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's so interesting. And in deciding how to measure it, we would be forced to define it. Effectiveness more clearly, which is always a good thing for all of us. Julia.
Thank you, Claire. Great panel, very good discussion. Couple of points. The first one has to do with the consequences of the discussion. This goes beyond data. I mean, the issues that we're discussing here have more to do with politics, with power sharing, with human relationships. And data is just the word that we have in common for expressing the need for inclusion or the need for recognition of differences between our society. And in thinking about this, we think about the role of the state or the role of government. Governments are extractive. I mean, we pay taxes. Governments are prescriptive. They legislate laws and regulations. So data, in a way, when it's related to government, it has some of these characteristics. Second very important point, this is the World Data Forum, and data is an overarching word for many things. From the Panama Papers, which is personal data, to official statistics, which is a completely different concept. And we have to be clear about these distinctions. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Julio. Really important point.
Yes, hi. Is this on? Okay, I can speak loud. Hi, I'm Grace Stefan from UN Human Rights. So in our office, we work on this human rights-based approach to data, which is essentially trying to put together human rights and statistical standards while putting people at the center when we do our data work. And so I wanted to respond to Claudia, to your 2 points on that our processes are extractive and that our processes are prescriptive. So I want to use the example of the recent data collection that we had, which is the number of conflict-related deaths in the 10 years of conflict in Syria. So for this data, we work with casualty recorders on the ground in Syria. Many of them have been tortured, imprisoned, and some sadly killed in the process of collecting this data. And in that work, we have been accused a lot of times that this is extractive. And what we have found useful is to collect the data collection to accountability. So in the end, we had our High Commissioner report this number to the Human Rights Council, calling for accountability mechanisms to investigate each of these deaths, because there are people behind each of this number. And I think that's one way that we can make our processes not just extractive, to connect it to accountability. And when it comes to prescriptive, I think we have to be a little bit prescriptive. And this is to the point of Francesca, because in official statistics, we have our standards. We have to have rigorous statistical standards. And that's important because the same for the Syria example, we need to be able to defend the data that we are collecting. So it's a challenge because our data collectors on the ground, we have to say to them, sorry, we have to have a definition of what is a civilian. You know, we have to put certain standards. But that's for us that this work that they have done will not be wasted, right? Because we can stand by and defend the number that we collect.
Thank you. Sinead from NSO Angola. My question goes to Charles, who has actually spoken about Data Regulation Act as being implemented in Rwanda. So my question is, in a time where data and technology has been actually outpacing regulation, so has the implementation of the Data Regulation Act in Rwanda actually been able to reduce the invisible people's fear in sharing the data, thus bridging the gap in inclusivity? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really interesting question. I've got one more here at the front.
Yes, thank you. Boris Engelson, a journalist freelance and the worst possible journalist for your misfortune. First, your enthusiasm to all for activism is very ill-timed because in France, noted sociologist Nathalie Heinrich just produced a book, what I translate it into English, How Activism Has Killed Science. So I am very impressed for your desire to leave the realm of science, but I think it would deserve 1 year. I have not been long so far. So since I am cut on the first one, the second one, someone said we should not make assumptions. Each time we choose an indicator and try to fill it with figures is an assumption on its relevance or not. Again, it would deserve a 1 year workshop. And third, there is something in all what you said which made me think of, you know, the confession at the priest. Father, I have sinned, I have not listened to the people, but I am going to improve. I don't think this is science.
Thank you. And I think that really, and I think, you know, I think we are in a world here, are we not, where we, you know, we have, in a sense, made statistics a science, you know, science of the state. That's what statistics means. And and we're trying now to bring in, as with many disciplines, I think this follows to some extent the trajectory of other academic disciplines, economics, for example, where, some of the assumptions of the sort of neutrality of science are being questioned. Not that the scientific method or that the actual sort of fundamental realities of the world should be questioned completely. Obviously, there are ways that things work. There are laws of physics, but that how, ultimately the way that we measure, the way that we measure our societies and what we do with those measurements are questions of societies. They are social and political questions, as well as ones that need to be governed by some of the very hard-won lessons over many centuries around the rigor and the rigor and the certainties of official statistics. And in many ways, there are many sort of ways of characterizing some of the kind of challenges that we're facing in this project, and one is exactly that, is how we safeguard what we know about the realities and the rigor of statistics, while also engaging with the world as it is and as people want it to be, which is not a scientific question, which is one about values and norms, and how those worlds can come together, just as much how the worlds of public and private can come together, and the worlds of citizens and the state can come together, and so on. So there's a lot of trade-offs here. I'm going to allow the panel, starting at the end with Charles and coming this way, just to make a change, to come back with, very, very briefly. We're slightly over time, for which my apologies, but it's been a fantastic conversation, and I will then very quickly close us out. So if you can bear with me for another 3 minutes, panel.
Thank you very much. I will maybe just follow up on the question with my colleague outside, and the Director General of the National Office of Statistics is here. I think he's more qualified to speak on behalf of the government of Rwanda when it comes to regulation. What I was trying to mention is, I've seen that the data regulation policy is comprehensive. I'm part of a steering committee. I've seen a little bit of change, and Rwanda is this one place where they have the infrastructure, be it in the policy side, that is in place, and they're moving forward. It's not perfect. I think there's room for improvement. So in conclusion, just back to the question that you say, the power of the private sector of the government, I think it should be a trusted relationship. We need to empower the government with getting the competency, the capacity that they require to write policy, write regulation that makes sense, especially in the digital economy. It's not easy. That's what I will say. And then also learn from best practices, have benchmark. I take the comment about being able to measure what we're doing. I've seen a lot of blah, blah, blah in international conference, which is true. This one, no. It's the best. All right. But the next one will tell us whether this one is the best, which is like, let's check in the next to say, what have you achieved? So I like the point of how do we measure all these statements that we made to say, are we moving forward? What is the definition of success? I think we're moving forward. So that's a good one.
It's always the best conference when you're on the panel. So activism has changed. It used to be placards, and these guys would deny and are quite emotional. But there's a whole science behind activism, actually. In fact, the new activism is science, interrogating things that have been stated and finding out if they're true or false and making demands for change. So everyone should be activists.
It is much more perverse.
Yes, I'm also for activists, but I want to make the point that what we're doing is scientific, and we can make it work, and we can ensure the quality of the data. It's a question of how we do it and how we understand, who to talk to. And it's a question of getting up from our table and going to the other table, as Claudia was saying. But I think we can do that within the framework of official statistics, including everybody and understanding what to measure, how to measure it, and for whom. And then showing that we can do it, fulfilling the quality principles, but then we have to show the impact. And then, goes back to what Grace was saying, the impact of the data, and showing that with those data we can really change and improve the lives of those who are affected. So we need the activists, and I'm all for it. And I think coming from the official statistical community, we should embrace that, and we should get at the better understanding on how to do it.
There's an interesting analogy there's a very strong normative and ethical framework that underpins medical science. and medical research, which has evolved over time following exactly these conversations. So that's quite an interesting analogy. Claudia.
Yeah, absolutely, Claire. And I was going to come and say that science is questioning, fundamentally questioning. Statistics is often about estimation, so it's not as prescriptive as perhaps you think it is. National statistics officers should absolutely be at the core. They uphold our gold standards, and that's absolutely what they should be doing. And what I was saying about prescription wasn't about you throwing away your fantastic standards. Believe me, as an ex-official statistician, a perfectly sampled household survey that's stratified is a thing of beauty. But it's in the standards that we apply that we need to think about the prescription. And you can still apply those standards. So I think that's where I'll end.
Thank you. I think that we should not get us confused, because inclusiveness is not an issue of assumptions. We cannot make assumptions about inclusiveness. It's the reality, and we have to make reality visible. So it's very important that we should make it clear that we are grasping some information about the real world. Sometimes statisticians, we develop indicators and we make assumptions about the indicators, but inclusiveness is not an issue of assumptions. It's some positive perspective of the real world that we are trying to make it visible in order to orientate public policy or some other decisions for some other agents in our society. So I believe that this is something that it's essential in the new role that official statistics, for example, are performing, and it's the ethical framework of what we do and the values of the society that we are approaching due to these statistics. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a perfect summing up. No, I think that was exactly right. Thank you all so much for really... Thank you all so much. I just want to recognise my colleague Jenna Slotin here, who actually leads the Data Value Project. So please, if you want to find out more, speak to Jenna or subscribe to the Data Values Digest, for which you will get a dose of controversy and activism in your inbox every week. And thank you so much, and I wish you all a great conference.